And I'm so pleased to have two returning speakers from last year, Anne Cavoukian, Dr. Anne Cavoukian, the architect of privacy by design, and Silkie Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch in the UK, and also a wonderful newcomer, Beatrice Botero Asila, who is involved, runs actually, is a founder of the Edgeland Institute that looks into urban spaces and what digitalization means for us all in our spaces. So I hope that there's going to be a very good discussion, not just all the wonderful questions we've already had coming into the World Ethical Data Forum, but also between ourselves, because this is such a crucial discussion that we all need to have when it comes to our basic human rights, when it comes to privacy and things like that. Just before I kick into the questions, I was thinking of this session in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly, because in the session we had in October last year, it was actually quite dystopian. So I do want to try and delve into what might be the good as well as the bad, and also what is potentially the ugly going forward. And the reason I'm very happy to have this conversation rather than just moderating is because I was writhing around with a huge number of questions last October because of my own personal experiences, but because I was moderating, I couldn't ask them. So I want to do that tonight too. My background is as an MI5 intelligence officer. So I know exactly what it means to be surveyed by the intelligence agencies and by the police. And I also know quite how intrusive it can be. So everything that you were saying at the last session just shows that it's scaled up from people who might be specifically targeted to people who are now endemically targeted because of the digitalization of our world. So that's what I really want to dive into to begin with. So welcome back and welcome, Beatrice. And can I dive in with the very first question, which is the idea of smart cities misleading? Would digital or cybernetic cities be a better name?
With due respect, what name we give it will be meaningless unless we know the technology underlying it. So smart cities was to provide assistance to people in the cities that we live in, navigating, taking care of activities that we're engaged in, all of those things in our residences, in our workplaces, etc. Digital ID is the same kind of thing, but to me, digital ID is actually far worse because when you have digital ID, it means that all of your personal information, and a lot of governments are now going to digital ID to, as they say, assist their citizens. If you retain my identity, my name, my social insurance number, etc., in digital form, it will make it that much easier for hackers and phishers to jump into it and gain access to it. That is my enormous concern. Governments are very weak in terms of security and implementing it. They may speak to the need for security, which is so obvious, but in terms of actually executing security measures, they're not good at it at all. And so if they start collecting digital ID, smart cities identification, etc., where is this information going to reside? It's going to reside in databases internally somewhere. And who is putting walls up around it so that no unauthorized third parties can gain access to it?
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing we're facing in the EU at the moment, I'm based in Brussels, is the idea of an EU ID card, which will give access to all the areas you've just mentioned, and also make you very highly visible wherever you go within the EU. So it is difficult. I mean, I think Silkie will probably have views on this because, at least in the UK, we don't have ID cards yet, right?
Yes, not yet. But there are moves towards starting with digital identity verification. That's a process that's going on at the moment. So the government is putting itself in a position where it will give a trust mark to private digital identity providers and then back up your identity. But we're also seeing proposals for other identity-based big changes like central bank digital currencies that would rely on digital ID. To some extent, COVID Pass doubled as a digital ID. So our sensibilities around digital ID are really being tested. And it does also significantly then affect how you interact with the space around you. If you think now even going to a supermarket, this is like a high-tech process. It's certainly a technological process. There are self-checkouts, big CCTV screens, and proposals to introduce biometric identity checking. And that could be through something like a government-backed digital ID. So it's these moves towards digital ID will also change and influence if we are moving towards smart cities, where ever more elements are digital and connected. Ever more of those elements are going to want to have your identity data as well.
So would you suggest it's about data is knowledge and knowledge is power?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really central to this, and that's why privacy matters so much. It's about individuals being able to harness and assert control over themselves, over the personal sphere, and that's a buffer between you and power. If a smart city is a database city, then the balance of power between individuals, whether it's individuals in the state or individuals in corporations, is significantly impacted.
Yeah. And if I may, because I agree with Silke totally, privacy is all about control. It's about personal control relating to the use and disclosure of your personally identifiable data. This is critical. That's what we will be losing if we will be going all the way towards smart cities and smart governments or whatever.
No, I totally agree. I do want to bring in Beatrice, though, because I love what the Edgelands Institute is doing. And the fact that you do pop-ups and you are trying to empower people in less empowered areas of the world to recognize what they can do and how they can push back against these sort of infringements. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm wearer of many hats, like many people. So I teach cyber law at Sciences Po in Paris, but I also co-founded an institute called the Edgelands Institute. And exactly as you said, we try to go to the non-suspect cities or different non-suspect cities of the world and understand how many of these dynamics are playing out in places where maybe scholars are less engaged or civil society might not be paying as much attention. So we are currently active in 2 cities in Colombia, in Medellin and Cúcuta, which is a very small border city with Venezuela. Medellin, you might know from the movies. We're in Nairobi. We're also in Geneva, which is where we're incorporated. And there we really do a lot of work. We have researchers on the ground, but we also work a lot with youth and communities to understand how growing practices of digitization of security is impacting them, how they feel about it, and then what are ways to tackle some of the issues that we identify. So actually our work is very city-based and it's kind of hard to generalize. But I was following this conversation with great interest because I'm from Colombia and I grew up with an ID. And I always think it's very interesting, the distinction between those of us who come from, let's call it civil law countries, the French, the Spanish, and maybe people who come from Britain or the former British Empire, where the relationship with a national identification is very, very different. And I think one of the things to observe in the global South maybe is that these dynamics are less symmetric. So we don't really see infrastructures of control to the extent that are actually imaginable here. That happens for different reasons. It's not to say that a surveillance state doesn't exist, but you have informal economies, you have informal neighborhoods, and I don't want to romanticize informality nor poverty. That creates other forms of control, other forms of oppression that are very concerning. But you do have different ways to navigate the city that are really not intermediated by technology in the ways that we think about them from Europe, for example. But it's also interesting to see the relationship. Like I feel less uncomfortable with the idea that there are some spaces that I enter with my ID, and that also pushes maybe to what Anne you started with. It all depends what this thing is being used for. So if I need to use my ID to go to the doctor because they want to check that I am the patient that booked the appointment, that sort of makes sense. Like I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I don't know if it needs to be digital, right? My ID is a piece of plastic with my picture, and there's a lady that says, "Yeah, sort of looks like her." So those types, I think part of the problem is the digitization, the centralization of the information, as you mentioned, and then Silky, your example is terrifying. I think there's a lot of how we structure and design these architectures to create spaces for freedom. Also, I worry a lot about how this looks like for maybe people who don't have their migration paperwork in order, and the more digitized the spaces become, this is they're going to be able to inhabit. And that's terrible from a human rights perspective. That's a huge public security health, a public health issue as well. And I think it's important for people like us to raise it also in terms of, you don't really want to have a portion of your population excluded like that. Singapore saw it very badly when they had a huge COVID outbreak happening in their migrant population because they weren't well taken care of. And yeah, anyways, I talked too much.
No, I totally agree. I mean, this is one of the, we touched on this issue at the original session that we did in October, only briefly, about the exclusion of people, particularly immigrants coming in, and thereby not having access to this sort of state-controlled information, so they don't get the state protections that they might need as well. So I think this is quite key to a number of different discussions. Having said that, though, I do want to go back to some of the questions. We got a lot from people. So I just want to pick up on, ideally, how would digital technologies be implemented in urban environments, and how can they be used to improve cities, which I think fits in with the displacement of people as well, the people that won't necessarily be recognized, won't necessarily have the right identification.
It will all depend on the way in which it's executed. As I said earlier, if the data are protected, so if you embed what I call privacy and security by design from the outset, meaning right from the beginning, you have protective measures around the data that can reside in a database, but it's encrypted end to end, or you have homomorphic encryption, or you have there's synthetic data now. There's things you can do to collect the data, and it can serve the purpose it's intended for. Data utility is very important, and you can have privacy strongly protected. It can't be an either or. In this day and age, forget zero-sum models of win-lose. No, you need these measures in place, but you also need to have very strong protection. And I'll give an example. I was agreeing with Beatrice. She said, well, I have some of my data collected and it's necessary for the doctor or whatever. I agree with that. Here in North America, there's something called the Nexus Pass. And what it is, it's facial recognition, but only one-to-one. So if I apply for a Nexus card, I live in Canada, I want to go to the United States, then I get my picture taken. That is the picture that resides in the database. So when I go to the border, so that I can hopefully get through easily instead of waiting hours, I go to the camera, it compares my live face to the picture that I authorized it to have on set, one-to-one comparison, and I get through right away. It's wonderful. So this facial recognition, one-to-one is fine. It's one-to-many, which exists everywhere, especially in the UK, and is extremely problematic and has a major false positive rate. In the UK, several years ago, they did a thing, and 83% of the matches were false positives, meaning people were falsely accused of having committed a crime or doing something. So it's all how you do it.
Yeah, can I just interject, because I really feel we need to bring Silky into this, because it was her organisation did most of the research.
Great.
Yes, and in fact, you'll be pleased to know the figure is now 89% inaccurate. We just released last week our new report, Biometric Britain, which is a stock take of all of the facial recognition that's being used across the country. So yeah, unfortunately, the situation here is not good from a facial recognition perspective. Now, I would maybe challenge that even further and say that even one-to-one facial matching has problems. They are of a totally different type to live facial recognition. I absolutely agree. And live facial recognition, from a privacy perspective, from a human rights perspective, I think has to be a red line. But even with one-to-one matching, there are known problems with racial discrimination and demographic accuracy bias in the algorithms. This is a big theme in a documentary that I was involved in called Coded Bias. It's available on Netflix. And it's about an amazing researcher called Joy Buolamwini in the US who found that it was only when she put on a white mask that she was able to be facially recognized, despite the fact it was obscuring her face because she's a Black woman. And so I think as technology develops, some of these problems will be, these early accuracy problems will be addressed. But it started to make us think more critically about how biometric data is used more broadly. For example, another example of one-to-one facial matching in a smart world. In schools now in the UK, some of them are trying to introduce smart tills in the lunch halls, where children pay for their school lunches with a facial biometric. And to some degree, the schools think, well, that means they don't have to touch anything. We just point a camera at them and they go and get their lunch. But our concern is, obviously there are concerns about the data and where it goes. But even if that's all watertight, do we want to train a young population of people to be giving away your body data for kind of, mundane, everyday reasons? The kind of technology, the kind of security checks that you expect to see on borders, in airport arrivals being used in school canteens. I think that there is a place for one-to-one biometrics for sure, but we ought to be really thoughtful about where it is. I think supermarket checkout, school lunches, this is not the kind of place that you want to be telling people you've got to give your body data now. I wouldn't give a DNA swab to buy a bottle of wine. As much as I love wine, I wouldn't go that far. We need to raise the consciousness of how important biometric data is to you, and exerting control. I think, Anne, is the word that we were using earlier. Control and consent in the world, especially when that data is getting ever more valuable.
Yes.
I think that's one of the key points, is that data is a commodity. It's a hackneyed old phrase, data is new oil. I don't necessarily agree with that. But in terms of who has control of it, who has access to it, who is storing it, and who can manipulate it, as we go into the more generative AI era as well, that becomes more and more concerning. I also remember I used to do a lecture every year at a school in Essex. They loved it. It's all about spy stuff. And this is going way back to the late noughties. And when the children went into the school to register, they had to give their fingerprints. So we're talking 14, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So, this has been going on a long, long time. I do want to raise one other thing as well. There's been quite a lot of activity in the European Commission at the moment around the idea of trying to end end-to-end encryption, blanket-based, across the EU, to protect children against paedophiles and predators, which is a noble cause. But there are different tools to do more warrant-based and precise attacks against known predators, rather than just, eviscerating all our human rights across the EU. Do you have any thoughts about that? Beatrice?
Yes, so many thoughts. I just came back from CPDP, which is a big privacy conference. It actually ends today, but I couldn't be there today. And there were two panels at some point. One of them was on children's rights on the internet. And yes, the internet is not necessarily the nicest place for children. So there's a lot of actual risks. It's not only small children, you also have a lot of mental health issues coming up amongst youth, eating disorders, and so on, that people are rightfully worried about. And there was this other, but then that panel didn't have the conversation about encryption. And then there was another panel, like where the Apple people and some other privacy organizations were talking about encryption. And I thought it was so sad that these panels hadn't been in conversation, because but I think the anecdote goes to the point that I'm a big fan of encryption and think it's terrible. It's a terrible idea to get rid of it. It's maybe opening a very big Pandora box to try to kill a monster. That's and I think another thing that's anecdotal, maybe there's a paper I will write about this. children's rights tends to be something that has been mobilized throughout the history of the internet to push a variety of reforms. Like, it's very hard to say no to children's rights. So when you can frame something in terms of children's rights, that gives you some political consensus. But I think part of the panel and the conversation did make me think about the actual risks that are there. And so this isn't my field, but there should be certainly be some metadata type of analysis and measures being put in place to avert some of the harmful internet traffic. Maybe some of the harmful internet traffic is the type of traffic that not only not children should not be as exposed to, but actually, I don't know, adults also have fragile mental health, and we could think about this more systemically. But I do think that if we want to win the battle for encryption, it is really much worth it to take very seriously the question about children's interests, minors' interests, because otherwise it's just a conversation where we're just not gonna meet anywhere reasonable. And maybe another very small point on that, because it was touched upon earlier, is that something that's very particular about children and children's surveillance is that they legally can't consent. So that is something very different about putting a surveillance camera in a place where most of your public is expected to be an adult, whereas children who they're just not supposed to be in a situation where they're being asked to consent about something that might prejudice them.
That's an interesting point, actually, about smart cities, isn't it? You know, the sort of growing surveillance technology, and the children don't have a say.
Can I say this? Oh, sorry.
No, Silky, please.
I mean, it just might be relevant that this is happening in the UK at the same time as well. Obviously, it's happening in the EU. And exactly the same proposal here in a bill that was originally pitched as a children's safety bill that ended up being a Christmas tree of all the sorts of horrible tech related things that different ministers coming in and out of posts wanted. Annie, you'll remember, because we spoke so much about it at the time, of course, we've already got a act in the UK called the Investigatory Powers Act, whereby companies can be issued with a notice and told to secretly undermine their end-to-end encrypted services. What this bill does is creates the power to force companies to build into their apps surveillance. Basically, they're looking at client-side scanning. So basically, if you want to have an end-to-end encrypted app, you're also getting spyware on your phone. And the reason we absolutely have to take children's safety and security online really, really importantly, I completely agree. It's not you're thrown open to everything on the internet. But all the worse if your child's on the internet without encryption, where the photos they send to each other, the messages they send to each other, things that they're doing are not protected and are weakened. But actually, we know this isn't about children. Sorry, it's just not about protecting children. Already, the companies are flagging tens of thousands of pieces of content to law enforcement all the time of child sexual exploitation, and they have too much to process. There's way more content going up to law enforcement agencies than they're acting on, which tells you something else, about what this really is. It's this kind of, it's what Annie's been speaking about for such a long time. It's the collect it all mentality. It's more like a psychopathic need to be able to see everything and have access to everything. It's a kind of surveillance mentality, and that should be a warning. If this the equivalent of private houses, private rooms where you can have a private conversation, the digital equivalent of curtains, that everything has to be thrown open, what does that bode for a so-called smart city where data about you is being collected everywhere all the time? It suggests that there will be, according to the current kind of ideology, there will be people that will want to collect it all and turn it into something, people that will want to watch it.
I think that's a very good point. Just to pull back, This was something that some NSA whistleblowers talked about in the late 1990s, early noughties, when they, in the NSA, the government snooping posts in America, basically said they wanted to achieve what they called total mastery of the internet. So this was just hoovering up everything. And now, of course, we're at the point where the technology makes it very much easier to do it at a more localized level within our own cities. And it's aided, I wouldn't say abetted, but it's aided by the technological developments of the private corporations, whether they are wittingly or unwittingly predated on by spy agencies or criminal hackers or whatever. We know from the Edward Snowden disclosures, and that's 13 years ago this month, I can't believe it, that they have backdoors into a lot of these corporations. So we are vulnerable in so many different levels. So pulling back down to the smart cities debate, as I think we've touched on many, many times in the course of this conversation already, who is going to own the data, who controls the data, who stores the data, who has access to it? These are the key things. I mean, this goes back to privacy by design, Anne, doesn't it? About how we control what data we allow them to get. And this is something I think we do need to explore. I'm also conscious we're coming up to the half hour, and there are about 10 more big questions I need to ask from our community. But yes, if we can just have a quick play with that one, that would be fun.
So control obviously should reside with the data subject relating to the use and disclosure of their personal information. Now, will that always happen? Of course not. Sorry, my camera's not working all the time. The problem is, it all depends on the context. Let's say you live in an apartment building. So the superintendent says, well, they'd like to have facial recognition to facilitate gaining access into the property when they don't have a doorman, you know, things like that. So the individual has to make the decision. Do I want to permit that? They don't have to permit it, but if they feel it would be beneficial and they have the trust in place with the superintendent owner, then they can consent to that and put the walls up around any third-party uses of that data. So I always say it all depends, because privacy doesn't mean no to utility. Data utility will be critical over time, and it's growing. But the control is the way in which the data is utilized, and that the data subject, the individual, retains control over that. Now, that's the ideal picture. Is that happening everywhere? Of course not. But that's the ideal that we're leaning towards.
Yeah, yeah. So this follows on to one of the questions I do have to ask. Are there any cities that could be regarded as a role model of smart cities, or any countries are doing it right?
Not that I can think of. Silky?
Well, I was just thinking, if anyone knows the answer to that question, it'll be Anne. And I'm going to take that as a conclusive no then.
You know what's so sad? There was a smart city contemplated in my city in Toronto, Canada, a few years ago. And they hired me to be the privacy person to make sure it was done right and embed privacy by design. And at the beginning, they were doing everything I told them, embedding privacy here, there, protecting the data. It was wonderful. But then they wanted to get other companies to join. And the other companies said, look, we can't do all that with the data. We need to use the data. We can't just scrub it and do all that. And so the original individual said, okay, well, we encourage privacy by design, but if you can't do it, then that's up to you. They said that to the companies. And as soon as they said that, I resigned the next morning. And the blowout was enormous. I mean, countries all over the world contacted me, and they couldn't believe I was giving up a very profitable position for this smart data. And I said, are you kidding me? Smart cities, the reason I work is because I want to protect data, privacy in smart cities, not the opposite.
Can I lob in the phrase open source at this point? If anyone wants to leap for that.
Open source, of course, is very important, but I don't think it's enough. I think the intent of the data has to be identified upfront. That's why privacy by design is all about being proactive. Proactively identify the intention, how you're going to use the data, and then implement ways in which you can exercise that. It's all in the way it plays out. So that's my response.
Beatrice, can I ask, because you've probably got a wider perspective about, you know, trouble spots around the world with the work you do with Edgelands. What are your perspectives on this in terms of how governments are cracking down, or corporations are getting a stranglehold, or open source is making resurgence, or communities are protecting themselves?
Yeah, I think fortunately my perspective is a little bit more optimistic.
Yay, we've got a good bit,
So
finally.
So I think unless in really crazy examples like Sidewalk Toronto or maybe very high tech cities, what we see in our work are that smart cities don't really exist as the thing we are imagining very often. Um, there are some exceptions, right? And I don't really know the exceptions. South Korea apparently has something very cool. Singapore, very cool in the terms of like very new, very wired everywhere. But most cities have a lot of, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I want to live there at all. But most cities have a lot of path dependencies that aren't digital, and therefore it's not really like everything is digitized at all levels of the infrastructure like they wanted to do in sidewalk. Administrations are a little bit more inefficient. Data sets are disconnected, and connecting them is actually very expensive. So a bunch of cities are struggling doing that, maybe don't want to do it. And so I think that the good city officers that we are talking to are at the same time now looking at the critical conversation and trying to figure out how they develop their strategy. And so I think the takes of, sorry, there's so much noise right now behind me. I don't know if you're hearing that for some reason. The good city bureaucrats are trying to be nuanced about it as they follow both conversations at the same time. So this isn't 2016 anymore. I think people are a little bit more, and so those that are coming to this second wave of smart cities are coming way more nuanced to it. Interestingly, also, data security issues are being very good for data privacy issues, because all of a sudden this desire that people had to collect all information and store it 4 or 5 years ago is now also a very big liability and very expensive for them. So how they balance that risk, which is a financial concern that they have, has actually good implications for privacy, because it's no longer necessarily what they want to collect everything to store it for forever. So I sort of see that it's a little bit, or there's hope. I don't know if it's so much better, but I think there's some hope for us not to all end up in a dystopia.
There always has to be hope, absolutely.
Yes.
I'm just scrolling through some of the questions that are coming in. One is about ransomware. Groups that have increased the amount of critical infrastructures, power, hydro, etc., that they target and having success in completing breaches due to growing attack surfaces. With a city having every potential person as an attack surface, what should people do to look for when choosing a smart city to potential living? Bit of a mouthful. So basically, all smart cities are going to be vulnerable to takedowns. And therefore, how do you assess which ones might be the most secure against ransomware or other cyber attacks?
If I may jump in, I think the safest city in those terms is the most analog city. And so some of and I think it's typically harsh and hard to place that responsibility on the citizen, the same way that relying on consent for data collection is like, I just consent to a bunch of things because I need to live in the world that we live in. And so I tend to advocate for way more systemic fixes and responsibility being allocated in more powerful actors. But I think for policymakers, the takeaway is a lot of your city needs to work offline, because this might happen. You need to have copies of your data. You need to be able to connect with your police officers with walkie-talkies, because if WhatsApp crashes, as it did, as it has a couple of times, those are infrastructures for which you need to have a plan B.
Well, WhatsApp got cracked in 2015 after the San Bernardino attacks, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. I mean, I think there's also an added aspect that and this is something that came up in our original panel discussion last October, it's all about education. If people don't know what the potential threats are, then they can't even think about mitigating against them. So how do we spread the word?
This is exactly what we're doing. We need more of these kind of communications with all parties, with the public. I do a lot of public speaking, and I also speak to specific groups, not just corporations, et cetera, in the government. And in the past, I would speak to a public group, and I'd have to explain to them why I thought, it was important that they be careful with their privacy and stuff. Now or recently, I don't have to do that. I go in, they've got a dozen questions. I mean, concern for privacy is at an all-time high. In the last public opinion polls of the last 2 years, 90% of the public very concerned about their privacy, 92% concerned about loss of control over their personal information. So I think spreading the word as best we can, just like this, is critical.
Silke, I mean, I know you've been campaigning for years, trying to get the word out about data privacy and online privacy and everything. I mean, what would you add to that?
It's really tough. I mean, in particular, people care about security more than they care about privacy, but the two are connected. Yes, there is a sense of this kind of being an abstract problem. Incidentally, I think that it's a lot of smart devices that have actually sharpened people's thinking about this. For example, when people are getting internet-connected baby monitors, or home devices that are then being hacked, then that literally brings it right home, and you've got the problem in the four walls of your own home. And then people are thinking a bit more seriously, both about the risk of nefarious hacking, but also about data collection, corporate data collection. We've seen lots of cases now of voice assistants sending very sensitive audio clips of private conversations in people's homes to people working in the companies who are listening to them to refine the product, basically. And so I think that actually it probably is that these small devices, rather than, you can have the Snowden documents out there published for 10 years, as you said, revealing mass scale interception and surveillance, but actually the thing that makes privacy more tangible might be, when people are using voice assistants, basically putting microphones in their homes and then realizing that their privacy has been compromised by doing that. It's changing to some degree the way that people are thinking about their own privacy and data security.
I would hope. I mean, Beatrice mentioned she's been at CPDP this week. I spoke there a couple of years ago and was on a panel as well with a guy who displayed a smart doll that he had hacked. And apparently he'd hacked it using the same techniques that, going back to the children issue, paedophiles had used to hack into these toys that could then spy on your children and actually speak to your children. So I think issues like that actually do make it much more personal for people to think about technological implications around privacy.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly not like everyone. This isn't. I'm not trying to say that everyone is now thinking about privacy in a wiser way because of this, but I find when we're talking publicly about privacy and security that it's these kinds of things that are minimally invasive compared to some other bigger impact technologies that have more impact on the way that people think about them.
Yeah. Shall we dive back into the questions? I'm going to hit you with a hard one. What is the most extreme example of invasion in privacy in smart cities in this context that you have come across?
I think you probably can't. Obviously, I'm getting a bit annoyed actually with people dismissing China simply because it's extreme. I mean, I think we have to talk about it because it's extreme. And we've been, although we're a UK only organisation, we've been looking at use of street technology in China because one of their leading surveillance companies, Hikvision, is all over Europe and used extensively in the UK. which is a big ethical and I think security problem for us. But I think there you see in extremis, in the wrong hands, used for bad, very severely bad purposes, smart technology being used to basically construct an open prison, particularly in the Xinjiang region, where anything from surveillance cameras, checkpoints, automated monitoring, anomaly detection, ethnic profiling is being used to pursue probably the world's first high-tech genocide happening right now. And that should serve as a warning about the kind of maybe international protections that we need.
I think that's an interesting point, this duality, the fact that China's evil because they do these things, whereas in fact, what's been going on in the West can be potentially just as invasive. And I think that's what we're all trying to raise awareness of. Anne, what would your take be on this?
China, to me, is appalling. They have these social credit scores. Every member of the public has a social credit score. This high school student who graduated last year with brilliant A+ marks. I mean, he was just brilliant. And he applied to universities, of course. He was rejected from all the universities. Why? Because the social credit scores of his parents were not considered acceptable. They jaywalk too much or whatever the stupid thing is.
Wow.
I just think that kind of thing is so appalling. And when you collect so much personal information like that, as they do in China, on every member of the public, and then the government is not restricted in any way in the ways in which it can use and abuse that information, to me, that is just appalling. It's the exact opposite of freedom.
Yeah. That takes me back a little bit because I've been researching and studying all this stuff for years. There was something, I think it was about 15 years ago, where in the UK, when they started to roll out all their CCTV cameras, they also used smart CCTV, which had speaking capabilities. So it was trialed in a couple of council areas in the UK, where if someone did something like drop a bit of litter or whatever, they could actually be talked to from a speaker on the CCTV thing. Anyway, I'm just saying that because I've just found another question saying, some smart speaker systems are vulnerable to high frequency attacks, the ability to play a sound to execute malicious code. Oh, God. Does this raise concerns regarding the feasibility of incorporating voice technology in smart city environments? Anyone?
I don't know. I think I have understand the question, but part of my reaction is that I think there's always an underlying question that people need to ask, which is, why do you want voice technology in urban environments? And there may be many good reasons. So you have a very simple technology. You have streetlights that sometimes also have like a voice. I want to call it plugin. It's not a plugin, but you understand, that says you can cross now or something, or you can't cross now. And that's very useful for the visually impaired or for children maybe, right? So I'm not saying that there may not be good reasons to incorporate some of this tech in urban spaces. But I think there's also this fetishization ultimately about making it like the smartest, most AI driven thing in the universe, when many solutions are cheaper, are equally effective, while being less data intrusive. And I think that's where the advocacy should go to. And I am by no means saying that I think there's a lot of value in tech focused on cities that makes a lot of things efficient. So yes, we want cities with less traffic. Yes, we want to save water. Yes, of course, we want to save energy. Like, all of that makes a lot of sense. But all of that can usually also be done in ways that aren't crazy privacy intrusive. And I think that's sort of where the focus should go to, always asking, why do you want this?
The key question, isn't it? I mean, the other issue around this total over-reliance on tech when it comes to our urban and actual national infrastructure is the national security issue, because it leaves a very wide attack vector for cyber criminals or cyber terrorists who want to shut down key bits of our infrastructure. So, for example, if you're in the Netherlands and you need to have working flood defences and the computers are shut off, oomph, you're flooded. So a lot of this stuff does have rather bigger considerations as well. I've got a question for Anne here. Anne has previously mentioned anonymizing data at the start of collection opposed to later on. How can employees be the voice that advocates for this at the beginning of the projects that include infrastructure?
Could you repeat the last part? How can
employees be the voice that advocate for this at the beginning of projects that include infrastructure?
It really depends. When you said the word employees, that's what I wanted to tune in on. Employees are obliged to their employer to do what they're hired to do. So it all depends on the context. They may not have the ability to say, we have to scrub this data. Now, it all depends on circumstance. What I always say to the CEOs of companies, listen to your employees. Make sure that they're aware of the privacy considerations that need to be respected, and listen to them when they bring it to your attention that they're not being respected. And the CEO usually says, well, they don't bring it to my attention, and they're way lower than I am. Then I say, good. Then have them report to someone very senior who reports directly to you. Because I think the most important thing is you have to get the CEO or someone very senior's their attention when there are privacy related issues that employees can verify and want to address. So I say, listen to your employees. They may not have the power just to eradicate the concerns that they identify, but they should be able to flag it for someone very senior who could then take a look at it and say, yeah, we don't need these personal identifiers anymore. They've served their purpose. Delete them. That's the other thing I always tell companies. Once you've collected personal information for a particular function, which has been consented to, primary purpose of the data collection, once you've collected and it's done, it served the purpose it was intended to, delete the data. Save yourself the trouble of keeping this around forever and have a data breach or something else.
And what about the law enforcement aspects, where they are required to hold data for X number of months or years or whatever?
Well, you're not going to go around law enforcement. There's no question. If this is a requirement of law enforcement, companies can then be taken to court if they don't oblige. So I'm not gearing this to law enforcement, but what I say about law enforcement is if you have a need for personally identifiable data, go to the court, get a warrant, convince the judge. Then if the judge is convinced you have a warrant, then by all means you have to do that.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, it's about proportionality, isn't it, rather than blanket surveillance.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to the nub of what we're talking about when it comes to smart cities, because we are not giving our blanket surveillance consent willingly. If they have a cause to investigate us for whatever reason, then therefore they should be able to get a warrant and do it.
Yes.
Beatrice, what would you say about the proportionality issue when it comes to law enforcement and intelligence?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I got this. I don't know. Maybe you can help me here. I've heard this question from one of the persons that runs the security department in Medellin, and he's I think a very careful, thoughtful guy tech-wise. And he once asked me for how long he should store the data, and I was like, like the international standard. I don't know. The Court of European Justice said, I don't know, I think it's 2 years, I forget right now. And he said, our legal system is slower. So that's not enough for me. Because I might get a warrant 3 years from now for and he's right. You have systems that are the global south is called the global south because our institutions are slower and inefficient. And a lot of the security balancing that needs to happen is also a function of the institutionality around it. So actually his question was, is there a way I can pre-select the data and not be legally liable? And I don't really know. But I think one of the ways, if I were tech savvy, I'm not a lawyer, one of the ways in which I think employers of these institutions, both in the private and public sector, is finding better ways. Because I think this is very often a power conversation. You might be the best meaning privacy engineer at Google, but as long as that is the business model, that's just how it's going to be. But why don't you just, it'd be great if one of those well-meaning privacy engineers finds a better business model. That would fly, that would go very many places. And it'll be also great if someone can come up with a mechanism to sort out early on what seems to be valuable data sets or not. So some things that maybe are useless can be deleted. And that shouldn't be impossible, right? Like maybe moments where the streets are empty at night, like there's very little probability but that's a call of judgment that's very hard to make. But I think coming up with creative solutions like that sort of go centered to the logic of the system and the incentives, that's where I think regular people can be very, very helpful.
No, that's great. One other question that sort of leads on from that actually is, can surveillance ever be justified as being necessary for security? Where is the line? Silky?
I think definitely yes. Obviously, surveillance has a place in a modern world, and can be used for good, and it can be used to keep people safe. And unfortunately, I mean, the fact that the question even has to be asked, I think, is representative of the fact that there's been this kind of false dichotomy set up of, that privacy activists are purely anti-surveillance for the sake of being anti-surveillance. That there's a privacy world and a security world, and that there's no space in between. And I think the reality is that the situation that we currently live in is just so extreme. The surveillance that we live under is so extreme that we're not talking about really surveillance directed to keep people safe, because we're not talking about directed surveillance. We're talking about exactly what you were referring to earlier, Annie, and that you've advocated about for so long, about that kind of collect it all, master the internet mentality. And it is interesting to have this conversation almost 10 years since the Snowden revelations, because I really thought on that day, reading about the sheer scale of the electronic surveillance, and then of course the Tempora revelations about the UK, where there was literally a buffer for all activity on the internet, and then these databases with all of our internet activities, contacts, networks, being collected by default. I thought it would change everything. And I thought, this is so dangerous to have this totalitarian architecture in a democracy, that at some point the totalitarian architecture and the democracy are going to clash and one of them's going to win. And maybe we're still living through that process. I don't know. I mean, I don't feel we're at the conclusion of the story yet. I hope not, because especially if, that's what the Snowden documents reveal relates to, by today's standards, a fairly analog world. For example, facial recognition that was spoken of in those documents was people's webcams being intercepted to train facial recognition algorithms. Now we have facial recognition cameras working in real time on London streets. We're looking at smart cities. We're looking at everything being connected and everything collecting data. So, yeah, there's still this relates as much to privacy as it relates to security. And I hope that there's a positive conclusion of the story yet to come.
We can all hope that. I'm conscious that we're coming up to 5 minutes to the end of the hour. I'd like to give you a minute or two each just to sort of summarize your thoughts. I mean, of course, we need to ground back to smart cities. But actually, I think this is far wider, because whatever happens in smart cities, it actually reflects the wider cultural norms that we're having to live with at the moment. So can I go to Beatrice first, just as a quick summary, your take on this?
Okay, so my takeaway, I think, and it builds on what Silky was saying, is that if this is ultimately about safety and safety in cities, privacy is actually a big part of it. I think the other side of the equation is that hyper-extended surveillance also makes us unsafe in many ways, and makes a lot of people of vulnerable communities very unsafe. And I think, Silky, we find in our research exactly the same as you. Privacy seems like this thing, kind of complicated, not very sexy, I have nothing to hide type of problem. But then when you talk about safety, they do land there. And when we manage to frame privacy in terms of their safety too, sometimes it's a little bit, I hope, I don't know, still testing. But I think it's encompassing and trying to bring both conversations at the table at the same time might be important and a good way forward.
That's fantastic. Silky.
Well, I think I probably concluded in what I was saying before, but I think, yeah, in terms of how if we're going to have smart cities, let's do it extremely carefully, be conscious of not just what's around us, but what's in our own pockets, what's in our own homes, and be thoughtful about it. I want to share Beatrice's optimism, and I do actually have it deep down, that there is a positive, good way of doing this. But if we're not winning bigger ideological battles on things like mass electronic surveillance, then I think that the future would be very bleak. I've ended it on the word bleak. Sorry.
Let's have a little bit of utopia, Anne.
Well, before the utopia, it drives me crazy when people say, well, if you have nothing to hide, what's the problem? Why do you need privacy?
I loathe that myself, yes.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You want to open up your entire life to the entire world? You have no personal comments or feelings or it drives me crazy. Get rid of that thought. Privacy is all about control, personal control over the use and disclosure of your personal information. It's your information to do with as you wish. And of course, there are benefits in sharing that information. I always say it's not privacy versus security. It's privacy, and you have to have both. Of course, we need security, very important reasons. And we can embed privacy within security measures. Get rid of the dated zero-sum mindset of either or, win, lose, forget it. You must have both privacy and security, always.
Thank you so much, you three. It's been such a pleasure. I could sit here and talk for the rest of the evening with all of you, which at some point we will do, I promise. But I just want to say the one thing I have taken away from this is the sense of hope, not necessarily dystopian ideas, because we are up against some really serious problems. But the fact that people like us are still trying to argue these cases and spread the word around these cases and educate, I think, is the key point. And we just need to keep spreading the word and lobbying and trying to make a difference and trying to help the tech development too. So I think that is the key point I'm taking out of this conversation, that lots of people are very, very concerned about these issues, and we do need to make sure that we get it right. I think we're at a sort of bifurcation in terms of where we're going with technology, and we need to make sure it goes down the right path rather than the wrong path. And yeah, this conversation has given me hope. So thank you very much for rejoining us and joining us, Beatrice. And I would love to stay in contact with all of you, of course, and carry on this conversation perhaps at the next forum. Thank you very much.
Okay, pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.